You're currently upgrading your gold mine or silver mine to the maximum level, thinking you'll soon be making dozens of ducats in profit. But in reality, your state expenses are increasing, not your income. You've got plenty of cash to spend, yet you have no idea what to spend it on, so as usual, you spam RGOs. And instead of growing, your income is collapsing dramatically. Yes, all of this comes from the changes in patch 1.2 for Europa Universalis V, where building an economy has surprisingly become simpler, you just have to do it properly. And I'll explain all the changes and how to adapt to them in 9 quick points. Welcome imperialists, Lucas here. Let's start with the mechanic that causes the richer and more populous your country becomes, the poorer you actually are. In general, this revolves around the new national wealth mechanic, because wealth and population increase your country's economic costs, and these are the two biggest values here, which additionally grow with every extra institution you adopt. As for the tax base, you could briefly describe it as the efficiency with which your country collects taxes. So the bigger the gap between wealth and the tax base, the poorer you effectively become. Because what's the point of generating money somewhere if you're unable to collect it, while at the same time you're increasing the cost of your court or, for example, diplomacy? What's worse, uncollected taxes increase the wealth of every social estate exactly according to how it is distributed in each location. And the more money a given estate has, the more its power grows. And once it exceeds 25%, every additional percent of that estate's power reduces your ability to collect taxes from it by another percent, which creates a self-perpetuating machine that, if you do nothing about it, will lead your country into economic ruin. Wealth treats all your location as if you had 100% control over them and displays that number. If you actually had 100% control across your country, then the tax base and wealth would be equal. So in theory, the solution to this problem is very simple. You just need to increase control and you'll earn more money. Just like you keep more money in your pocket when you buy games from this channel's partner, the online store ENEBA. The exact offer link is in the description of this video. Highly recommended. Control is a broad topic and I could spend another hour explaining every modifier that affects it, but for you, the most important thing is that the capital is the initial source of control, because it generates 100 proximity points. As you can see, the capital has 100, while the surrounding areas have significantly less. In simplified terms, proximity translates almost 1-to-1 into control. Besides the capital, additional sources of proximity are local governors. Right now, we can build 2 such buildings at the start of the campaign. As technology advances, we can increase that number, probably up to 5 or 6 at most. On top of that, we also have maritime governors. For those, we need to use the appropriate government reforms, up to 2 maximum. And Byzantium also has a unique mechanic that grants an additional land governor. Iberian countries can also build a governor variation called the lieutenancy, but it counts toward the same limit, so it's not anything extra. Besides that, villages have bailiffs, which increase control by 20%. And of course, towns, cities, and megalopolises themselves also increase control. Then from the second era onward, we can unlock this building that can be constructed in towns and cities, which also affects maximum control. For local control to grow, you need to build one of the previously mentioned buildings that provide control. And in the case of proximity, simply reduce the cost of proximity spreading throughout the surrounding area. And of course, the best way to do that is by using natural rivers, as well as building a road network across the entire country, by constructing buildings such as bridges or canals, which increase proximity speed. And thanks to all these measures, proximity from the source can reach farther and farther away, especially as technology advances and we gain access to better roads. But that's how it works on land. At sea, meanwhile, you need to send a fleet on patrol. While a fleet is patrolling, it increases the so-called naval presence in a location, and the higher it is, the more it reduces the costs of proximity moving across seas. In coastal locations, it's also worth constructing all kinds of buildings that increase harbor capacity, because capacity affects proximity costs. You can also grant city rights, which increase harbor capacity. And basically, now you already know how control works and how it spreads. But how does that actually translate into collecting money from those locations? Take the capital as an example. Look, just like I said, when you have 100% control, wealth equals the tax base. And then you collect a percentage of taxes calculated from that very tax base. The exact percentages are shown below here. In neighboring locations where control is no longer 100%, you can see that the tax base has already been reduced, meaning you're collecting lower taxes right from the start. Many different parameters affect the amount of taxes collected, but generally speaking, the biggest factors are the privileges you grant to estates and the laws you establish in your country. So to summarize, you collect the highest taxes where you have the greatest control anyway, because that's where your tax base grows the fastest. And where control is low, the tax base grows more slowly than wealth. Which brings me to the point where I'll now simply tell you where to build and where not to. I'll start with production buildings, which produce goods, so in short, they generate money. You'll usually find them in the burgher or laborer categories. You can also find such buildings among the clergy and peasants. Regardless of the type, I always try to build them first in the capital or later in local governors, and I upgrade them to the maximum level. That gives me the biggest possible bonus to production efficiency. Each building level grants an additional 1%. Production efficiency works in such a way that it simply produces 20% more while consuming the same amount of materials, which effectively allows you to maximize profit per location. Right now, this modifier is so strong that I can confidently say without hesitation that it's always worth moving toward a capitalist economy. Back in patch 1.1, you could still debate this topic. I even showed several countries where I built powerful economies based on a traditional economy, but that no longer works nearly as well, just like spamming buildings literally everywhere. During the first and second eras, I don't specialize cities too much. In the capital alone, I can place over 100 buildings, and the current maximum building level is 10, so I try to make the most out of that 100% control in the capital. However, if you've reached the maximum building level in the capital, or a given building type has reached its cap and it's still worth constructing more, then do it in the next locations with the next highest control. Simply build additional cities and towns and do exactly the same there as you do in the capital. Seriously, don't develop cities that are farther away, it's not worth it, especially if a given location has below 50% control. Personally, from time to time, I even demolish these kinds of buildings there. Everything changes, however, with the arrival of the third era, where in the printing press technology tree I can unlock borough privileges technologies. These privileges increase the efficiency with which we produce a specific type of good, or sometimes even increase building limits. The downside, however, is that they reduce production efficiency, and that applies to all buildings, even the ones they enhance. You can see these when you check the production efficiency of any goods in a city where such a right is active. So it's not worth granting more than one right. If I granted 3, I'd get minus 15% production efficiency, meaning I'd effectively gain no bonus at all. Besides, now in every location you can preview which goods are produced most efficiently there. And notice that once these modifiers stack up, the production bonus can become absolutely enormous. In Constantinople, I managed to reach plus 73%. And thanks to the fact that Constantinople has 100% control, I collect practically 155 gold in taxes there, because I can tax the estates producing there that heavily. And that's not even the maximum, I can go higher, because a given production facility requires raw materials, and those are usually obtained from RGOs. Usually. Previously, you could do this mindlessly, because the rule was, if you don't know what to spend money on, just spam RGOs. That rule no longer works. Especially for expensive resources, such as this iron, for example. This location increases my wealth by 10, yet it doesn't even provide me with 1 ducat in taxes. With silver and gold, these differences are even larger. So try to build RGOs mainly in places where you also have high control. The construction planner is very helpful for this, because I simply mark locations that have no less than 50% control. Everything is clearly visible, but of course on this list you can also immediately see how wealth grows and how much budget income will increase. In such remote locations, you can of course build bailiffs, which always improves the situation somewhat. Or make sure they have slightly worse market access, because as it says here in the tooltip, they will earn less, meaning they will strengthen wealth less while still providing the same amount of raw materials. So in the previous patch, you wanted the highest possible market access everywhere. Currently, that's not always the best solution. So yes, constructing production buildings or building RGOs in low control locations will definitely increase your country's wealth. But because you'll have a low tax base there, you won't be collecting taxes, while your country's expenses will continue to rise. And this becomes even more true the lower your tax collection is. So essentially, we return to the first point, the richer you become, the poorer you actually become. Personally, I stick to the rule that below 50 control points, I build nothing. Although, to be fair, there are buildings that I spam literally everywhere, just like before, because the more of them I have, the more they increase my income. There are buildings, let's call them service buildings, such as temples, armories, and bridges. And these service buildings exist in practically every social estate. These buildings themselves simply do not generate income, you use them to gain certain modifiers. In fact, they even seem to be nothing but a cost. However, from the state treasury, you only cover 20% of the maintenance cost of such a building, plus inflation. The rest of the maintenance cost is covered by the market itself. When you have a lot of theaters, universities, or temples, demand rises for all the goods required to maintain those types of buildings. And this causes the prices of those goods to steadily rise month after month, which translates into increased national wealth as well as a larger tax base. And if you have these buildings in good locations, then you'll earn much more from taxes. These buildings also require workers from the upper social classes, and those classes in turn require various goods in order to function in the game, and far more than ordinary peasants do. So once again, this increases the prices of goods on the market, and thanks to that you earn more. And yes, using the market building as an example, you can see that I literally build these everywhere, without even looking at control. Demand for goods on the market is also influenced by maintaining a regular army and a fleet, because they also require resources for upkeep. Although in this case we cover between 50% and 100% of the costs ourselves. But to reduce army and navy costs, you simply need to produce more of the resources required for maintenance. So overall, by increasing market demand, you increase the prices of goods and you increase your income, assuming your buildings were placed well. And now I'll show you how to increase demand even further, which is so simple that it's honestly strange nobody does it. Trade itself is horribly unprofitable when compared to other sources of income. However, Paradox also changed things up here quite a bit. First of all, they introduced a new mechanic called trade orders, and the trade range mechanic has been completely redesigned. Right now, the limits of trade routes are determined solely by their profitability. By researching trade range technology, you simply increase the distance at which you can trade without suffering additional distance-based trade cost penalties. Now I'll show you how to increase the price of goods using the new trade orders mechanic, where I simply order the sale of a larger amount of cloth. I wait a month, the game even finds fairly profitable trade routes, and the price of goods itself starts rising. You can immediately see that with each passing month, I collect more and more taxes in this location. Because when goods become more expensive, those buildings earn more money, so they pay me more taxes. And that means that in a moment I'll even be able to build more of these kinds of buildings in order to supply even more goods. Then I'll further increase trade capacity and start exporting even more of that good, up until the point where it stops being profitable. So you also need to pay attention to that in order to avoid additional costs here, which can sometimes become extremely large, and you won't always notice it here. But in the case of trade, I often simply try to break even, because I can collect far larger percentages from taxes than from trade, where profits depend on crown power. Well, unless you place your production buildings and RGOs poorly. If you actually want to make money from trade, you only need to fulfill two simple conditions. Have cheaper goods for sale than all the countries around you, which you achieve precisely through production efficiency. You produce more for less, which I already covered in detail in point 3, where to build. Of course, you can also export RGO-based goods, meaning raw materials. In that case, you're simply playing around the traditional economy. The only problem is that many countries around the world play around the traditional economy. So you'll face enormous competition there. Meanwhile, capitalist economies are most commonly played by merchant republics or regular republics. The second thing is reducing trade transport costs, which you achieve simply by increasing this modifier. Unfortunately, for most countries, achieving this requires heavily developing a capitalist economy. Because once it reaches 50%, we gain access to one of the most powerful economic government reforms, the banking system reform, which reduces merchant costs by as much as 40%. Although when it comes to this modifier, merchant republics remain unmatched, because from the very start of the game, they can reach up to 90% cost reduction. Other countries have to wait until the Reformation era to gain another 50%. And honestly, I feel like this modifier used to be available through technology as well, but currently I can't find it. And yes, by reducing trade transport costs, we're simply able to trade across greater distances before trade stops being profitable. And here in my republic, one of my trade routes reaches all the way to Adana. But even better, we can reduce trade transport costs even further thanks to the navy, which becomes even more important. And yes, by now you already know that this game has something called naval presence, which you increase through the patrol action. However, this action really starts bringing benefits once you combine it with these two buildings, because when we construct them, they allow us to send fleets to the locations where our trade outposts are established, so they can improve our naval presence there. Naval presence itself also greatly increases a country's presence within a given market, which pushes us higher on the list and gives us priority when conducting trade in that market. But starting from patch 1.2, it also reduces the costs of transporting goods by sea. You won't actually find this information in the tooltip or anywhere in the game itself, but it is mentioned in the patch notes. So great, now you know how to efficiently increase the production of your goods so they become the cheapest, and then how to distribute them around the world at low cost. But do you know where to get workers for a rapidly expanding economy? In patch 1.2, population growth was changed. In the previous patch, essentially only peasants reproduced, and through the social promotion system they joined other estates depending on demand. And technically that system still exists, it's just been reduced tenfold. Now every social class also reproduces, alongside population growth, and seriously don't ask me how priests reproduce, but apparently locking only men inside a temple has a positive effect on it. Although I think you can also see nuns here. That's why in the second era I recommend unlocking this technology in banking, the social ladder. It grants access to a cabinet action that accelerates social promotion into higher classes. We also shouldn't make the mistake of turning every location within a province into towns and then cities. Population growth in villages is naturally higher by default, and despite the fact that Paradox nerfed the population growth bonus from food supplies, within a mixed system, where we have at least one city or town within a province combined with large food reserves, and granting this urban privilege, we can still significantly increase population growth. But villages will always have the highest growth. Of course, you can also choose free subjects within social values, although that isn't always such a good choice, as I'm about to show you. On the current patch 1.2, the choice between serfdom and free subjects is simply more complex. Generally, I choose whichever value I already have more of at the start of the game, or whichever one I can raise to a very high level fairly quickly, because that provides the biggest economic boost. But if we go into the details, for most large countries or countries planning to wage wars, serfdom is always the better choice, especially if we are a large country struggling with the spread of control. However, if we are a large country, such as Bohemia, which doesn't have control issues from the start of the game, then from a purely economic perspective, free subjects are better. This comes from a mechanic called peasant enfranchisement, and generally speaking, it is always higher in locations with higher control. And in that case, most taxes go to the peasants rather than the nobility. Small and medium-sized countries also tend to have high control, so here as well it's usually better to go with free subjects. However, I also often choose serfdom purely for military reasons, because thanks to it I get 25% more levies and replenish them 50% faster. But if I switch to free subjects, I wouldn't just lose 25%, I'd effectively lose 50% overall. Because first I would lose the serfdom bonus, and then I would additionally receive the penalties from free subjects. And until you have a regular army, that penalty is absolutely massive. Alternatively, if you're a wealthy Italian state, you can probably afford mercenaries. But in most cases, I personally switch to free subjects later in the game, once I already have at least one regular army. Later on, after 1450, free subjects unfortunately always perform better economically. Thanks to them, you can even reach 100% peasant taxation. With the nobility, I usually manage somewhere between 50% and 60% at most. There are certain exceptions, such as the Japanese shogunate or France, where you can achieve really strong results with the nobility, but those are simply exceptions. Another exception are megalopolises, which were introduced in patch 1.2. Because to fully maximize the efficiency of your capital, you should build a megalopolis there as quickly as possible. It is currently the highest location tier in the game, and it provides incredible bonuses. By default, a megalopolis has as many as 4,000 workers and 4,000 burghers, and building construction inside it is accelerated by as much as 50%. The only problem is that it has incredibly demanding requirements in order to be constructed. It costs 7,000 to 8,000 gold. And you also need to gather 400,000 population, so not every location is suitable for it. And you can only have one per empire, Well, unless you conquer more. And precisely by following these mechanics that I've been testing recently, I managed to build a powerful economy in my campaigns. If you have your own methods for optimizing the economy, leave them in the comments. Let the whole community benefit from them. And now that you know how much patch 1.2 changed the economy, I recommend checking out my video where I show and explain how patch 1.2 completely shook up the vassal spam strategy.